Her hands were bleeding before the sun came up. Not from accident, not from carelessness, from work the kind that strips skin from bone and asks nothing back. Clara Whitmore drove the sharpened stake into frozen earth with everything she had left in her body, which wasn't much, and the ground refused to give, which was nothing new. The ground had been refusing her all year. The bank had been refusing her. The neighbors had been refusing her. Even the sky above the northern plains looked like it was getting ready to refuse her, too heavy and gray and patient, in the way that storms are patient, the way that ruin is patient, the way that everything waiting to destroy you seems to know it has all the time in the world. She drove the stake again. The ground gave half an inch. Clara Whitmore allowed herself one breath. Just one. Then she picked up the mallet and swung again. If this story moves something in you, if you believe that one person's refusal to give up deserves to be heard, subscribe to this channel right now and drop your city in the comments below. We want to know how far a story like Clara's can travel. The debt notice had arrived on a Tuesday. Clara remembered that clearly, not because Tuesdays meant anything in particular, but because she had spent the entire Monday convinced that things were about to get better. She had sold 2 bushels of preserved vegetables to Mrs. Alcott down the road for 60 cents, and 60 cents felt like proof that survival was still possible, that the ledger could still be balanced, that a woman alone on 32 acres, with 11 head of cattle and a sick younger brother and a husband, who had simply stopped coming home one October morning, that such a woman could still find a way through. Then Tuesday arrived and brought Mr. Grayson's letter with it. She read it twice standing at the door of the farmhouse, the cold already pressing through the gaps in the boards that she hadn't yet found the money or the time to patch. The letter was polite. Mr. Edmund Grayson, creditor and landowner of the adjacent 400 acres, was always polite. That was the thing about men like him. They had enough comfort that they never needed to be anything less. The letter reminded her in careful measured sentences that the debt her husband had taken against the property now stood at $240, that the agreed repayment window had passed, and that unless significant settlement could be arranged before the new year, Mr. Grayson would be compelled, regretfully of course, to pursue the legal remedies available to him. Legal remedies. Clara folded the letter and set it on the table next to the lamp that was running low on oil. Her brother Thomas looked up from the cot near the stove. He was 22 years old and had the face of someone 20 years older, hollowed out by the fever that had settled into his chest 3 months ago, and decided to stay. He had been a strong young man before the sickness, strong enough to help her manage the cattle through the summer, strong enough to repair the fence line along the north pasture, strong enough to make her believe they might actually get through this. Now he got up twice a day, once to eat, and once to use the outhouse, and even those short distances cost him something. What was it? Thomas asked. Nothing, Clara said. Go back to sleep. He watched her for a moment. He had always been able to read her. Even as children, he'd known when she was frightened before she admitted it to herself. Clara. I said it was nothing, Thomas. He didn't push. That was the mercy of people who are too tired to argue. They let you keep your lies because they understand you need them more than the truth right now. She went out to check the cattle. There were 11 of them, and she knew everyone by name, which the ranchers in the area would have told her was a mistake. Walter Hayes, who ran 300 head on the land east of hers, had told her that very thing last spring when she'd mentioned it in passing at the dry goods store. You name them, you get attached, he'd said, not unkindly. You get attached, you can't make hard decisions when hard decisions need making. Walter Hayes was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had been doing this long enough to know where sentiment led. Sentiment led to hesitation, and hesitation on the northern plains in a winter year led to exactly one place. Clara had nodded and said nothing and gone home and checked on Bella, the oldest of the 11, who had a soft way of pressing her wide forehead against Clara's shoulder that felt in the loneliest hours like someone choosing to stay. Now she stood at the fence and counted them in the gray morning light. 11, all present, all breathing. Bella stood nearest to her, and the others clustered in the way cattle do when their cold bodies close together, sharing what warmth their bodies could produce. The pen was open on 3 sides. It always had been. Her husband had planned to build a proper barn the first winter they were here, and then the money ran short, and then he ran shorter still on whatever it was that had once kept him in place, and the barn had never happened. A proper barn now would cost more than she had. More, in fact, than she could imagine having. Clara looked at her cattle and thought about what Walter Hayes had told her 3 days ago when she'd ridden over to ask his opinion on the coming winter. He hadn't wanted to give it. She'd seen that in the way he shifted his weight and looked past her at the tree line instead of at her face. But she had asked directly, and Walter Hayes was not a man who could refuse a direct question from a woman who deserved a straight answer. "The almanac's saying it'll be the worst in 30 years, he'd told her. "We had a reading like this back in '87. Lost 40 head that winter, 40. And I had a barn." He'd paused. "Clara, you need to think seriously about selling now while the animals still have value. Come spring, if this winter's as bad as they're saying—" "I won't sell them," she'd said. He hadn't argued. He'd just looked at her with the particular sadness of someone watching a person walk toward something they can't stop. "Then you'd better figure something out," he'd said, "because what you've got right now won't keep 11 cattle alive through what's coming." She'd been thinking about it ever since. Not about selling, she'd closed that door and locked it, and she wasn't going back to it. Selling the cattle meant losing the only income the farm could generate, and losing that income meant losing the farm, and losing the farm meant Thomas had nowhere to recover and she had nowhere to be, and everything her husband's absence had already half destroyed would be completely destroyed. She would not sell. But Walter was right about one thing. What she had wouldn't be enough. She'd lain awake 3 nights turning it over. She couldn't buy lumber. She couldn't afford hired hands. She couldn't build a conventional barn in time, even if she could afford the materials, which she couldn't. Every road that a practical person would take was a road that required money she didn't have. So she started looking at roads that practical people wouldn't take. She started walking her land. It was on the second day of walking that she found the stand of young birches along the creek bend, thin trees, flexible, the kind that bent almost flat in a hard wind, and then came back up when the wind stopped. She stood among them for a long time. She bent one with her hand, feeling the resistance, and then the give, watching the way it curved without breaking. She let it go and watched it return to vertical. She bent it again and again. And the idea arrived the way the best ideas do, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of something that had been true all along and was only now being noticed. She told Thomas that evening. He was sitting up, which was a good sign, eating a small bowl of the oatmeal she'd made with the last of their molasses to give it some caloric weight. He listened to her explain it all, the birches, the arching, the weaving of branches and straw and mud, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "A living shelter," he said. "The trees don't break," Clara said. "I've tested them. They flex. A rigid structure fights the wind and eventually loses. Something that moves with the wind." "Might survive it," Thomas said. He was quiet again. Then, "Have you ever built anything like that?" "No." "Has anyone?" "Not that I know of." He nodded slowly. He didn't tell her it was impossible. That was one of the things she loved most about him. He had never in his life told her something was impossible simply because it was unfamiliar. He'd always been more interested in whether a thing could be worked out than in whether it had been done before. "You'll need help," he said. "I'll manage. Clara." His voice had that tone, the older brother tone that he used approximately never because she was the one who had always managed everything. When he used it, she listened. "I can do more than you're letting me do. I'm not dying. I'm sick. There's a difference. Let me help you." "You can barely—" "Let me help you," he said again. "I can sit and weave. I can sort straw. I don't need to swing a mallet for that. Let me do something useful, or I will go genuinely insane lying here listening to you kill yourself out there alone." She looked at him for a long moment. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow morning." The first day nearly broke her confidence before it could build anything else. The ground was harder than she'd expected, and driving the initial stakes deep enough to anchor the saplings required more force than she'd calculated. Her palms blistered within the first 2 hours. The blisters broke. She wrapped her hands in strips of old cloth and kept going. She cut the young birches carefully, choosing the straightest and most flexible, leaving the root systems intact on the ones she planned to bend and anchor rather than sever. She wanted living wood, not dead wood, because living wood had memory. It would hold its shape over time in a way that cut timber wouldn't gradually growing into the arch she forced it into. She drove the ends into the ground in pairs, bent them toward each other overhead, and lashed them at the apex with cord. By midday, she had 6 arches. She stood back and looked at them. They looked, she had to admit, exactly like what people would call them, a basket. A very large, very ambitious, very absurd basket. She picked up the mallet and started on the 7th arch. Thomas came out mid-afternoon, moving slowly but steadily, and sat on the upturned crate she'd set near the work area. He'd brought the straw and the cord and his own 2 hands, and he began weaving horizontal branches through the vertical arches, the way she showed him tight overlapping passes, the way her mother had once woven rush baskets in the kitchen on winter afternoons. His breathing was labored at first, and she watched him without appearing to watch him, ready to send him back inside at the first sign that he was pushing past the edge. But he found a rhythm and settled into it, and color came back into his face from the mild exertion, and she decided to let him be. "Does it have a name?" he asked at one point, not looking up from the weaving. "A name?" "The technique. This kind of structure." "I don't know what it's called," Clara said. "I don't know if it's called anything." "We could call it something." "We could," she said. "Let's see if it works first." He almost smiled. Fair. They worked until the light failed. When they went inside, the structure had 3 completed walls and the beginning of a 4th. And if you stood at a certain angle and didn't look too critically at the rough edges and the gaps that still needed filling, it looked less like a basket and more like something that might conceivably work. The next morning, Walter Hayes rode past on his way somewhere and stopped at the fence line. Clara kept working. She heard him stop. She heard the creak of his saddle as he leaned forward to look. She gave him time to arrive at his own conclusion and kept her hands moving. "Clara," he finally said, "what in the name of God are you building?" "A shelter," she said. Long silence. "Out of trees." "Saplings," she said. "Flexible. They'll hold the arch without snapping under snow load. The weaving creates dead air pockets, same principle as stacking hay bales, except the structure is self-supporting, and the living wood will continue to draw moisture and stay pliable through the cold." Another silence, longer this time. "Where did you read that?" he asked. "I didn't read it anywhere," Clara said. "I worked it out." She could feel him looking at her the way a person looks at something they genuinely don't know how to classify. Not contempt. Walter Hayes wasn't a contemptuous man, more like the particular bafflement of someone encountering a problem they have no existing category for. "That thing won't survive the first serious storm," he said finally, quietly without cruelty, just what he believed to be true. "Maybe not," Clara said. "But doing nothing definitely won't." He sat there a moment longer, then he clicked his tongue at his horse and rode on. Clara watched him go, then turned back to her work. Her hands were still bleeding. She picked up the mallet. She drove the next stake. What Walter Hayes didn't see, what none of them saw riding past with their practical eyes, and their long experience, and their absolute certainty about what worked and what didn't, was what Clara understood from the inside of the thing she was building. Not from looking at it from the road and making a quick calculation. From living inside the problem. From sleeping 3 feet from a sick man and 11 cattle and a debt she couldn't pay and a winter that was going to come whether she was ready or not. From having nothing except the land she stood on and the trees that grew from it and the knowledge that those trees had survived every winter this valley had ever thrown at them. They survived, she had told herself in the dark on the third sleepless night, by not fighting, by bending, by giving the wind somewhere to go. She wasn't building a wall to stop what was coming. She was building something that understood what was coming and was designed to move with it. And that was a different kind of thinking entirely, the kind that came not from having more, but from having less, from being pressed against the wall hard enough that you had to find the door that the wall was hiding. By the end of the first week, 3 neighbors had ridden past, and all 3 had some version of the same reaction. A pause, a look, an assessment delivered with varying degrees of politeness. One of them, a younger man named Cooper, who ran a small sheep operation 2 miles north, had actually laughed. Not meanly the way boys laugh to wound, but the involuntary laughter of someone encountering something so unexpected that the body produces the sound before the mind can decide if it's appropriate. "Sorry," he'd said, immediately catching himself. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, it's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Clara asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something more conventional, I suppose." "Conventional costs money," Clara said. He'd nodded at that. He understood money. He wrote on. Thomas had watched the whole exchange from where he sat weaving, and when Cooper was gone, he said without looking up, "You know they think it'll fail." "I know," Clara said. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly. It wasn't nothing having every passing pair of eyes look at her work and calculate failure in real time. It wasn't nothing to build a thing that people laughed at while you were still in the middle of building it. "It bothers me less than freezing does," she said. Thomas nodded and went back to the weaving. The structure rose another 2 feet by sundown. It was on the 9th day that Mr. Grayson came. Not by letter this time. In person, which was different, which meant he'd decided the situation warranted a different kind of pressure. He arrived in the late morning in a good coat and good boots, which was his way of reminding everyone within eyesight exactly what category of man he was. He stood at the fence and watched Clara work for a full minute before he spoke, and she felt every second of that minute on the back of her neck. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. She straightened and turned to face him. Edmund Grayson was 53 years old, lean and composed, with the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had never needed to. He was not by any visible measure a villain. He was simply a man who understood leverage and was not sentimental about using it. "Mr. Grayson," she said. He looked at the structure behind her. His expression didn't change, which meant he'd already decided what he thought of it before he arrived. "I wanted to speak with you directly," he said, "rather than through correspondence. I think that's the more civilized approach." "I agree," Clara said. "Go ahead. The debt situation is, as I'm sure you're aware, becoming urgent. The winter markets are the last real opportunity to sell your cattle at anything approaching fair value. Come spring, if the herd suffers losses, which given—" He paused. His eyes moved briefly to the structure again. "Given current preparations, seems likely the value drops considerably. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the cattle now. It would settle a significant portion of the debt and give you a foundation to—" "No," Clara said. He stopped. "I won't sell them," she said. "Not now, not to you." The silence between them had weight. Grayson was a man accustomed to silences working in his favor, accustomed to women in difficult circumstances reconsidering when faced with the measured patience of a man who held the paper on their land. He let the silence run its course. Clara let it run with him and felt nothing shift. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with something that was almost gentleness, "I'm trying to offer you a way out before the situation becomes—" "I understand what you're offering," she said. "And I'm telling you plainly, I'm not interested. When the debt comes due, I will address it. But I won't surrender my cattle to a winter that hasn't happened yet." He studied her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, more like a recalibration. A man adjusting his understanding of what kind of obstacle he was dealing with. "Very well," he said. He straightened his coat. "I hope your preparations are sufficient, Mrs. Whitmore. I sincerely do." He turned and walked back to his horse and rode away without looking at the structure again. Clara turned back to the shelter. Her hands had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure exactly when. She picked up the mallet. The stake went in on the first swing. The mud mixture wasn't working. Clara had spent 2 hours testing ratios clay from the creek bank dry straw cut to finger-length water from the well, and the result kept cracking as it dried, splitting along lines she hadn't predicted, pulling away from the woven branches in thin curling strips that fell to the frozen ground like dead skin. She pressed her thumb into a freshly applied section and watched the surface fracture. She pressed harder. The crack spread another inch. She stepped back and looked at the wall. Then she crouched down and pressed both palms flat against the earth until the cold of it moved up through her arms and into her chest, and she stayed there for a count of 10, just breathing, because that was the only way she knew to stop the feeling from becoming something she couldn't manage. 10. She stood up. She went back to the creek. The problem was the clay. It was too dense on its own, inflexible once dry, which meant any movement in the woven frame transferred directly into the dried mud layer with nowhere to go except apart. She needed something that would let the wall breathe and flex without losing its insulating properties. She needed the mud to behave less like stone and more like skin. She stood at the creek bank for a long time, looking at things. Animal dung had binding properties. She knew that from watching adobe construction described in a book she'd read twice in the winter of '91, a traveler's account of building practices in the Southwestern Territories. The cattle pen had plenty of that available. Mixed at the right proportion with the clay and straw, it would add fibrous binding material and reduce brittleness. It wasn't a pleasant solution. It was, however, a solution. She was shoveling manure into the wheelbarrow when Mrs. Alcott appeared at the fence. Sarah Alcott was 61 years old, had outlived 2 husbands, and possessed the particular authority of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that most of its crises were survivable with sufficient practicality. She was not given to unnecessary kindness any more than she was given to unnecessary cruelty. She observed things accurately and stated them plainly, and this Clara had always found was worth more than warmth. She looked at what Clara was doing. She looked at the structure behind her. She looked at Clara's bandaged hands and the weight that had settled around Clara's eyes from 10 days of not sleeping enough, and the way Clara's jaw was set in the particular configuration that Mrs. Alcott had seen before on women who had decided something and would not be undecided. "You're mixing it with manure," Mrs. Alcott said. Not a question. "Binding agent," Clara said. "Reduces cracking." A pause. "Where did you learn that?" "I worked it out." Another pause longer. "Does it work?" "I'll know in about 4 hours when this section dries," Clara said. Mrs. Alcott watched her work for a moment. Then she said, "My grandfather built a sod house in the Ohio Territory before the war. He used manure in the mortar. The house stood 40 years. Clara stopped shoveling and looked up. "He add anything else to it?" she asked. "Horsehair," Mrs. Alcott said. "For tension. The fibers hold the matrix together when it tries to contract." Clara thought about that. "I don't have horses." "No," Mrs. Alcott agreed. "But you have 11 cows." Clara stood very still for a moment. Cattle hair. From the grooming brush, the winter coat was coming in thick now, and every time she worked the brush across their flanks, it came away loaded with the dense underfur that cattle grew against the cold. She'd been discarding it. She'd been throwing away a binding agent every single morning. "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me," Mrs. Alcott said. "Just don't let those animals die. They're good stock." She paused. "You're good stock, too, for what it's worth." She walked away before Clara could respond. Clara set down the shovel, went directly to the cattle pen, and picked up the grooming brush. Thomas watched her work the new mixture into the wall sections that afternoon and said nothing for a long time, which with Thomas meant he was thinking hard about something. It's darker, he finally said. The manure darkens it, Clara said. Does that matter? Only if we were trying to win a beauty contest, she said. We're not. He almost smiled again. It was the second almost smile in 3 days which she was counting. Every one of them felt like a small argument against the thing that had been eating at him since October. I've been thinking about the ventilation, he said. She kept working. Tell me, the cattle generate a significant amount of body heat. 11 animals in an enclosed space, the temperature inside could actually reach survivable levels even in severe cold if the insulation is sufficient. He paused to cough a short one, controlled, which was better than the long ones that came at night. But they also generate moisture. Respiration, manure, body heat, meeting cold air. If the moisture accumulates inside without anywhere to go, you'll have ice formation on the interior walls within a few hours of sealing it up. The animals breathe ice crystals, respiratory stress, weakening. Clara stopped working. She turned to look at him. You've been thinking about this for a while, she said. 4 days, he said. I wanted to be sure before I said it. So we need ventilation that lets moisture escape without letting cold air flood in. High vents, Thomas said. Hot moist air rises. If you leave small openings near the apex of the structure, not large just enough, the moisture vents upward and out, and the cold air coming in replaces it at floor level, where the cattle body heat immediately acts on it. He paused. It's how a chimney works. Same principle. Clara looked at the structure. At the apex of the arches where she had been planning to apply the thickest mud layer. I'd need to frame the vent openings before the mud goes on, she said. Otherwise I'm cutting into dried material later. Yes. I should have thought of that before I started the upper sections. You were solving one problem at a time, Thomas said. That's not a failure. That's just the order things happen in. She looked at him for a moment. When did you get wise? She asked. I was always wise, he said. You were just too busy managing everything to notice. She reframed the apex sections the next morning, leaving 4 small vent openings spaced evenly around the crown of the structure, framed with thin-cut branches lashed tight to maintain their shape when the mud went over them. The work cost her half a day she hadn't planned to spend, and she spent it without complaint because Thomas was right, and she knew it. And the difference between a shelter that worked and a shelter that almost worked was exactly the kind of detail that the almost version didn't get to explain afterward. It was while she was finishing the 3rd vent frame that she heard the riders. 2 of them coming from the direction of the road at a pace that wasn't casual. She didn't look up immediately. She finished lashing the frame 4 more passes tie-off test the tension, and then straightened and turned. Cooper from the sheep operation to the north, and beside him a man she didn't recognize, heavy-set and red-faced from the cold, sitting his horse with the slightly aggressive ease of someone who wanted to appear relaxed and wasn't quite managing it. Mrs. Whitmore, Cooper said. He had the uncomfortable manner of a man who'd been asked to do something he wasn't sure about. This is Mr. Dade. He runs the Dade operation out of Calverton, about 60 miles north of here. Mrs. Whitmore, Dade said. He was looking at the structure with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the bafflement of the local ranchers, not Grayson's studied neutrality. Something more complex. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man looking at a thing he wished he'd thought of. Cooper tells me you're building a living shelter for your cattle herd. That's right, Clara said. He tells me it's sapling arches, woven branchwork, mud and fiber composite over the frame. Yes. And you designed this yourself? I did. Dade looked at her for a moment. He had small eyes that moved quickly and assessed things in a way that suggested he did a great deal of his real thinking behind an unremarkable face. I lost 43 head in the winter of '88, he said. Good barn, solid timber. Cost me $600 and it wasn't enough. He paused. The barn didn't flex. Ice load built up on the roof. The east wall failed at 3 in the morning, and the temperature equalized with outside in about 20 minutes. 43 head. He said it the way people say numbers that still haven't finished hurting. Clara waited. "I'm not here to mock what you're doing," Dade said. "I'm here because I've been thinking about the same problem for 7 years, and I haven't solved it, and apparently you have, or you're trying to, and I'd like to understand how." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Get down off your horse." She walked him through it for 2 hours. The arch principle why flexible living wood was structurally superior to rigid timber under dynamic snow and wind load. The composite mud mixture, and why the cattle hair and manure produced a matrix that could absorb minor structural movement without cracking. The ventilation geometry. Thomas's contribution, which she credited to Thomas directly, and she saw Dade glance toward where Thomas sat, weaving with a look of reassessment. Dade asked good questions. Specific questions. The kind that told her he was not listening to be polite, but listening to understand, which was different enough that she found herself explaining things she hadn't fully articulated, even to herself, found herself discovering through the act of explaining that she understood her own design better than she'd known she did. "The crucial insight," she said at one point, "is that you're not building a wall against winter. You're building a collaboration with the materials you already have. The trees are already adapted to survive here. I'm just asking them to do it in a slightly different configuration." Dade was quiet for a moment. "That's not how anyone talks about building," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Most people who build things have the money to fight nature directly. I don't, so I have to work with it." He nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted the assessment, completed a conclusion reached. "Will it hold?" he asked. Directly. No softening. "I believe it will," Clara said. Equally direct. "I can't promise it. I've never done this before, and neither has anyone else as far as I know. But I've thought through every failure point I can identify, and I've addressed them. The ones I haven't thought of yet are the ones I'll find out about when the storm comes." She paused. "That's true of any structure." "It is," Dade said. He looked at the shelter for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "If it works," he said, "I want to hear about it, directly from you." "If it works," Clara said, "you'll probably hear about it from everyone." Hey. Cooper lingered after Dade rode away. He stood at the fence with his hat in his hands, turning it in circles, the way young men do when they're working up to saying something they're not sure how to say. "Mrs. Whitmore," he started. "Cooper, I owe you an apology." He said it quickly, like getting it out before he could rethink it. "For laughing. When I first saw, I shouldn't have. It was rude, and I wasn't raised to be rude, and I'm sorry for it." Clara looked at him. He was maybe 25, 26, had a good honest face that showed everything it was feeling, which was simultaneously a weakness and a kind of integrity. "I wasn't offended," she said. "You should have been." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have the time." She picked up the mud mixture and turned back to the wall. "If you want to make it up to me, there's a section on the south face that needs another layer before the temperature drops tonight." He blinked. "Right now?" "Unless you have somewhere more important to be," Clara said. He didn't. He tied his horse to the fence post and spent the next 3 hours applying mud mixture to the south wall under her direction, and he worked without complaint and with more care than she'd expected. And by the time the light started going, they'd finished the section, and he left with mud on his coat and something on his face that looked like it might have been the particular satisfaction of having been useful in a way that mattered. The crack appeared on the 14th day, not in the wall. She checked the walls every morning now with her hands as well as her eyes, running her palms along every section, feeling for the subtle differential temperature that indicated a gap in insulation or a failure in the composite layer. The walls were holding. The crack was in one of the primary arch members, one of the original birch saplings from the first day of construction, the one she'd driven in at the sharpest angle, because she'd needed the arch geometry to work out, and she'd pushed the wood right to the edge of its flexibility. She found it in the early morning before Thomas was awake. a split running diagonally across the grain about 18 inches from the base, where the stress concentrated. Not a full break. Not yet. But the fiber was opening. She sat on her heels and looked at it for a long time. If that arch failed, the section it supported would lose structural integrity. The connected weave would redistribute the load, but to members that weren't designed to bear it alone. In a heavy storm, the kind of storm that was coming, that redistribution could cascade. One arch, then the section. Then potentially the whole southeast quadrant. She needed to replace it, which meant removing the arch, resetting the base, weaving a new member into the existing frame without disrupting the mud composite that was finally, after all the adjustments, holding correctly. She calculated the time. 3 days of work minimum. She calculated the weather. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees overnight. The almanac and the ache in every farmer's bones for 50 miles agreed they had perhaps a week before the first serious storm. Maybe less. 3 days of work she didn't have. She stood up and went inside and shook Thomas awake. "I need you to talk me through a structural problem," she said. He was awake immediately. That was something the sickness had taken from him, the ability to ease into consciousness slowly. He woke fast now, like a man who'd learned not to waste the good hours. "Show me," he said. They went out together in the half-dark, Thomas moving carefully but steadily, and she showed him the crack. He crouched and examined it with his fingers, the way she'd shown him, feeling the gap. "The arch member needs replacement," he said. "I know that," she said. "I don't have 3 days." He was quiet for a moment. "Splinting," he said. "What?" "You don't have to replace it. You have to reinforce it. Same as a broken bone, you don't remove the bone. You stabilize it so it can continue to function while it heals." He looked at the split. 2 secondary members, one on each side of the compromised section, lashed tight enough to transfer the load across the failure point. The original arch still bears weight, but it shares it with the splints. It won't be as strong as a whole member, but it'll be strong enough. Clara looked at the crack. She looked at the curve of the arch and thought through the load paths. She thought about where the wind would push, where the snow would accumulate, where the stress peaks would concentrate in a bad storm. It would need to be lashed every 2 inches through the compromised section, she said. Not just at the ends. Yes. And I'd need to mud over the joint as soon as the lashing is set so the composite layer doesn't interrupt at the repair point. Yes. That's half a day, she said. Maybe less. Yes, Thomas said. She breathed out. Half a day she had. You thought of that fast, she said. I've been watching you solve problems for 2 weeks, he said. Some of it was bound to absorb. He straightened slowly, one hand on his knee. Also, I used to splint fence posts the same way when we couldn't afford replacements. She looked at him. You never told me that. You never asked, he said. You were too busy managing everything. She had the arch splinted and mudded by mid-afternoon. She was testing the lashing tension for the 4th time when she heard Grayson's horse on the road. She didn't stop what she was doing. She kept her hands on the lashing and felt the tension and adjusted the final knot by a quarter turn and tied it off properly. Then she stood and turned and looked at him. He'd stopped at the road this time. Not at the fence. The distance was a choice, she understood that. A man who comes to your fence is making himself a participant. A man who stops at the road is still deciding. He looked at the structure for a long moment. It was, she realized, the first time he had seen it completed to nearly its full height. The last time he'd visited it had been 4 feet tall. Now it stood over 8 feet at the crown. The mud composite dark and solid over the woven frame. The vent openings framed neatly at the apex. The whole structure carrying a weight and a presence that even she had to admit was different from what she'd imagined at the beginning. It looked against all reasonable expectation, like something that had been built on purpose. Grayson looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say anything. He turned his horse and rode on. And Clara stood there watching the empty road for a moment after he'd gone, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly, not yet, that was still weeks away, and contingent on things she couldn't control. But something adjacent to pride. Something that felt like the quiet recognition of a fact she had built it. Whatever happened next, storm or calm failure or survival, she had looked at the impossible problem, and she had not sold her cattle, and she had not accepted the offered way out. And she had bent the living trees into arches and woven the branches and mixed the mud and the manure and the cattle hair. And she had built the thing that everyone said she couldn't build. Whether it held was in the hands of forces bigger than her, but the building of it had been entirely hers. She turned back to the shelter. The cattle moved inside, their breath warm in the cold air. The first clouds of the serious weather were already building on the northern horizon, dark and deliberate, moving south with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. A week, she'd thought. She looked at those clouds. Maybe less. The temperature dropped 9 degrees in a single night. Clara knew it before she checked. The thermometer knew it from the way the air had changed, texture gone from cold to something denser and more deliberate, the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the skin, but pressed through it, looking for the softer things underneath. She'd woken at 3 in the morning, to the sound of the wind testing the farmhouse eaves, and lay there in the dark. Running calculations she'd already run 100 times, looking for errors she hadn't found yet, because the part of her brain that couldn't sleep was convinced there was something she'd missed and would not stop until she found it, or the storm proved her wrong. She found nothing new. That was either reassuring or the most frightening possibility of all. She got up at 4 and went to check the cattle. They were restless in a way that meant they knew. Animals always knew. She'd observed it before, the specific quality of unease that moved through a herd in the hours before serious weather. Not panic, not yet, but a heightened attentiveness, a tightening of the collective nervous system that expressed itself in small ways. Bella wouldn't settle. She kept moving to the shelter entrance and then back into the open pen, and the others watched her, the way they always watched her when she was uncertain, taking their cues from the oldest member. The way herds do, waiting for her to decide what the correct response was. "Come on," Clara said softly. She took Bella by the halter and walked her through the entrance of the shelter. The animal resisted for 3 steps, then yielded, that particular yielding that meant "I don't agree, but I trust you," and the others followed without being asked. That was the thing about 11 animals who knew your voice and your hands and the specific way you moved among them. They had made their decision about you a long time ago, and they weren't going to revisit it just because the situation was difficult. She counted them as they went in. 11. She stood in the entrance for a moment, feeling the difference. The shelter was dark except for the gray pre-dawn light coming through the vents, and the air inside was warmer than outside. Not warm, not yet, but noticeably different, in a way that meant Thomas's calculation was already working. The body heat of 11 animals in an insulated space was a real force. It would take time to build, but it was building. She checked the vent openings. Clear. She checked the splinted arch. Holding. She checked the south wall where the composite layer had been thinnest. Solid. She went back inside and made oatmeal and sat at the table until the sky began to lighten, which it did slowly, grudgingly, the way a sky lightens when it would rather not show you what it's carrying. Thomas came to the table, looking better than he had in weeks, which was the particular cruelty of sick people. Before major events, they rallied. The body summoned whatever reserve it had been hoarding, and you mistook it for improvement and let yourself feel hope about it. "How bad?" he asked. "Not yet," Clara said. "But today." He nodded. He wrapped his hands around his bowl and ate without speaking for a while. Then, "The shelter is ready." "As ready as it's going to be," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at her over the bowl. "You're not sleeping." "I'm sleeping enough." Clara. "Thomas. I am sleeping enough to function. That's the standard I'm applying right now, and I'm comfortable with it." She got up and took her bowl to the basin. "I need you to stay inside today." "I can help." "You can help by not getting sicker," she said. "You've done your part. The ventilation design is in there. The splinting solution is in there. All of it is in there. Now I need you to be alive and recovering on the other side of whatever today is, because I am going to need you in the spring, and I am not going to negotiate on this." Long silence. "Fine," he said. "Thank you. I reserve the right to stand at the window and feel useless." "Granted," Clara said. She pulled on her coat. "I'll take the uselessness over the alternative." Walter Hayes came by at 7 in the morning, and she respected him for the timing earlier than courtesy required, which meant he'd been thinking about it the night before and had decided to come before the weather made the decision for him. He stood at the fence with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, and he looked at the shelter the way a man looks at something he's been wrong about and is still deciding how wrong. "Storm's coming before noon," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Serious one." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man with something to say that he hadn't quite shaped into words yet, so she gave him time. "I've been ranching this valley for 19 years, he said finally. "I've built 3 barns, cost me more than I want to say, and one of them I'm still not sure about. And I looked at what you were doing over here, and I said to myself—" He stopped. "I said what everyone said. You know what I said." "I do," Clara said. "I was wrong to say it," he said. Flat, direct. The tone of a man who didn't apologize often, and therefore did it cleanly when he did. "Not because I know it'll work. I still don't know that. But you had a problem, and you thought it through, and you built something, and I dismissed it because it didn't look like what I know, and that was wrong of me." Clara looked at him. "Walter," she said, "I need to know something." "Ask it." "The 1887 winter. What killed the herds? Not the cold, specifically mechanically. How did the structures fail?" He thought about it. She could see him going back through the particular archive of a bad year that never fully closed. "The snow load built up faster than anyone anticipated," he said. "Flat roof sections collected it. Once you had 3-4 feet of accumulated weight, the support beams started going. And when the roof compromised, the walls lost lateral support. Everything after that was fast." He paused. "The other thing was, the wind direction shifted mid-storm. Changed from north to northwest, which meant structures that were oriented for one direction suddenly had full exposure on a wall that was designed to be a sidewall. The weak point moved." Clara thought about her arches. They were radially symmetric. There was no weak face, no single wall that bore more than another because the dome geometry distributed load equally in all directions. A wind shift wouldn't create a new weak point because all points were equivalent. She hadn't planned it that way consciously, but she'd arrived there. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked at the shelter once more. "I'll be at my place if you need help," he said. "Send Thomas." "Thomas is staying inside." "Then you know where I am." He looked at her with the complicated expression of a man who has arrived later than he should have at a kind of respect. "Good luck, Clara." He rode back toward his place without looking at the sky, the way people who live by weather learn not to look at it too often. It takes something from you, that particular vigilance. The wind came first. Not the storm wind, the preliminary wind, the one that arrives 2 hours ahead as a kind of announcement, pushing cold air south in long sustained gusts that carried the taste of something deeper and more serious behind them. Clara felt it change direction twice in the first hour testing angles, and each time she felt it, she thought about what Walter had told her, and about her dome geometry, and felt something that was not quite confidence, but was the closest available thing. She spent the morning doing everything she could still do. She reinforced the canvas door flap, cutting additional ties from the last of the rope, and securing it to anchor points she'd set in the frame specifically for this. She added a final layer of straw around the base of the exterior walls, where ground cold would transfer most aggressively through the mud composite. She checked every vent, cleared a small amount of frost that had begun to form at one of the openings, widened it by half an inch to maintain airflow. Inside, the cattle had settled. The temperature at chest height when she stood among them and breathed was noticeably warmer than it had been at dawn. The collective body heat was accumulating the way Thomas had said it would. She checked on the weakest one, a young heifer she'd named June, who had been losing weight since October for reasons she'd never fully identified, some internal process that good feed hadn't been able to fully counter. June was standing, which was the important thing. Standing and breathing and pressing her side against Bella with the trust of an animal that has decided proximity to the stronger one is the correct strategy. "Stay standing," Clara told her quietly. June looked at her with the large, patient eyes of an animal that doesn't understand what you're saying, but understands that you're saying it to her. The storm arrived at 11:43 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she'd been checking her father's pocket watch every 15 minutes with the obsessive precision of someone who understands that information, even information about things she can't control, is better than ignorance. 11:43. The wind went from sustained gusts to something continuous and structural. A sound that stopped being sound and became pressure, became a physical force that leaned against everything upright and tested it. She was inside the shelter when it hit full. She'd made the decision to be inside rather than outside, which meant trusting that the structure would perform rather than standing outside it, trying to manage something she couldn't manage from the exterior. It was possibly the hardest decision the whole construction had required, harder than the design choices, harder than the physical labor, because it meant surrendering the illusion of control and accepting that what she'd built would either hold or it wouldn't, and her presence outside would not change which of those things happened. The cattle pressed together instinctively. The shelter groaned. She felt it through her feet, the whole structure flexing under the wind load, the arches doing exactly what she'd designed them to do, absorbing and redistributing, not fighting the force, but incorporating it. The groan was not a failure sound. She'd thought hard about the difference between a structure complaining and a structure failing, and this was complaint material under load, expressing the existence of that load, which was normal, which was correct, which was the sound of a thing doing its job. The mud composite held. She stood in the middle of the shelter with 11 cattle and listened to the world outside trying to come in, and it did not come in. The first hour was the worst, because it was the unknown, because she had no data yet on how the structure would perform over time, only on how it was performing in this moment. And this moment kept changing as the storm intensified. She moved constantly, checking the frame by touch, checking the composite by pressing her palm flat against the walls, and feeling for vibration patterns that would indicate delamination. She checked the vents every 20 minutes, clearing frost with a thin stick she'd cut for exactly this purpose. The second hour was different. By the second hour, she understood the storm's rhythm, and the shelter had established a baseline, a steady state of managed stress that she could read and monitor. The arches flexed within a range and returned. The composite layer stayed attached. The vents breathed. The temperature inside was warmer than anything outside could account for, which meant the insulation was working and the body heat was accumulating, and Thomas's calculation was running exactly as he'd said it would. She sat down on the packed earth beside Bella and rested her back against the cow's warm flank. The storm screamed outside. Inside, it was bearable. She was checking the north wall for the fourth time when she felt it. Not a crack, not a failure. Something subtler, a change in the vibration character of the frame under her palms. A slight alteration in the frequency that told her the load distribution had shifted. She stood very still and kept her hands on the frame and tried to read it the way she'd learned to read it over 3 weeks of living with her hands against this wood. The wind had shifted. Not completely just a rotation of maybe 15 degrees, enough to alter the load geometry. She thought about what Walter had described about the way structures failed when the wind direction moved the stress concentration to an unexpected face. She thought about her dome. She thought about the symmetric arches. It held. The load redistributed across the geometry the way she'd calculated it would. The frequency in the frame changed again, not deterioration adjustment. The structure was doing what structures that understand their own geometry do, finding a new equilibrium. She breathed out. And that was when she heard the sound from the northeast corner. Not a groan, a crack. She was across the shelter in 4 steps, the cattle moving out of her way with the unhurried trust of animals who know the difference between urgency and panic and understand that the former doesn't require the latter. The northeast arch, not the splinted one, a different one, had developed a fracture at the midspan. Not a clean break. A compression fracture, the wood fibers crimping under a load pattern she hadn't anticipated, which meant the wind shift had changed the stress distribution in a way her symmetric calculations hadn't fully captured. The dome was symmetric in design. The load from a shifted wind was not. She had maybe minutes before the fracture propagated. She looked around the shelter for what she had. The length of rope she'd kept inside. The 2 spare branch sections she'd stored against the interior wall specifically because she'd known she might need them and had learned over 3 weeks to keep the next solution close at hand. She had the splinting technique. Thomas had given it to her. She went to work. Her hands were shaking, which she noted clinically, and overrode because hands that shake can still lash cord if the mind stays steady. She positioned the first splint against the compromised section, holding it with her shoulder, while her hands worked the cord around both members. The first pass, the second pass, pulling tight enough that the joint creaked. The fracture made a sound, not the sound of something giving the sound of something being held. She kept lashing. By the time she had the 4th pass done, the cattle had repositioned around her without being asked, their bodies forming a warm press on both sides, and she realized distantly that the additional body heat from their proximity was helping warming her hands, which had gone numb enough to affect her grip just enough to let her feel the tension in the cord again. She finished the lashing. She sat back and looked at the repair. It was rougher than the first splint, less planned, done under conditions the first one hadn't been. But the cord was tight, and the load path was re-established, and the arch was for this moment stable. Outside, the storm didn't care. It continued to do what storms do, press and howl, and insist on its own supremacy over everything humans build, and hope, and risk. Inside, Clara Whitmore sat on the frozen earth in a shelter made of bent trees and mud and cattle hair and rope, and 3 weeks of sleepless problem-solving, and she did the only thing still available to her. She waited. The hours had a different quality after that, not easier. The waiting was its own specific labor requiring its own specific musculature. She moved every 30 minutes, whether she needed to or not because she always found something to fix, but because movement was the enemy of the particular despair that comes from sitting still in the dark while something large and indifferent tries to undo your work. She cleared the vents. She checked the repairs. She laid her hands on each of the 11 animals in turn, not for any diagnostic purpose, just to feel the warmth of them, the specific and irreplaceable fact of 11 lives that were here, that were breathing, that had not yet been lost. June, the weakest, was still standing. That mattered more than she'd expected. Around the middle of the afternoon, she'd stopped checking the watch. The watch was beside the point. Now time had become something she was moving through rather than measuring. The storm reached its peak intensity. She felt it as a change in the pressure inside the shelter, a subtle compression, the world outside squeezing in every direction at once. The frame creaked. The composite wall sang a low-frequency note that she felt in her teeth. The splinted arch groaned. And then, on a frequency below sound, below sensation, more like the inner ear, adjusting to a change in altitude, she felt the structure commit. Not to failure, to survival. The flexion found its limit and held. The load distributed to its endpoints and held. The vent draft maintained its convective pull through the crown and held. Everything she had designed and built and repaired and argued for, in the face of every person who'd seen it and calculated failure, all of it reached its tested maximum and came back. The storm pressed. The shelter pressed back. It was Thomas who broke through. She heard him at the canvas entrance, his voice before the canvas moved, calling her name with a steadiness that told her he'd been standing there for some amount of time, deciding whether to call or wait. "Clara." "I'm here," she said. "I'm all right. Don't come in the canvas seal." "I know," he said through the canvas. "I'm at the edge. I won't break the seal." A pause. She could hear the effort in his voice, the controlled management of breath that had become his constant companion. "Tell me something true." She understood the request. He couldn't see. He was standing on the other side of a wall, in a storm, measuring her by the sound of her voice, reading for what the voice would tell him that the words might not. "The northeast arch cracked," she said. "I splinted it. It's holding. The main frame, holding. The composite in holding." Silence. "The cattle?" he asked. "All 11, she said. June's still on her feet." The silence this time was different. Longer. The kind that comes when something you've been afraid of turns out to be slightly less terrible than you'd prepared for. "Okay," Thomas said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a long time. Something younger than the sickness had let him be. "Okay. I'm going back inside. Don't die." "I wasn't planning to," Clara said. "Good," he said. "You'd be very bad at it." She heard him move away through the snow. She sat back against Bella's warm flank and laughed a short, real, somewhat desperate laugh that had nowhere else to go. The storm continued. But it was past its worst now. She could feel that too. The worst had come, and she was still here, and the shelter was still standing, and 11 animals were breathing warm air in the dark, and the structure she'd built from bent trees and mud and sheer refusal was doing precisely what she'd designed it to do. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to feel the warmth of it, just to let the evidence of a thing she'd built arrive in her body as something real. The storm broke at 4 in the morning. Not gradually, storms on the northern plains didn't taper politely. They stopped. The wind simply ceased its sustained howl and dropped to something occasional and exhausted, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that Clara felt it as a physical thing, a pressure releasing from her eardrums, from her chest, from the back of her neck, where she'd been holding tension so long, she'd stopped noticing it. She sat up. Around her, the cattle stirred the herd-wide shift of 11 large bodies, adjusting to a changed atmosphere, the collective nervous system decompressing from hours of sustained stress. Bella raised her head and held it still, listening the way animals listen when they're checking whether the threat has actually passed or is only resting. The silence held. Clara pressed her palms flat against the nearest wall section. No vibration. No load. The composite surface was cold under her hands, but intact. She could feel the grain of it through her fingertips, the texture of the embedded cattle hair in the dried matrix. Everything where it was supposed to be. She moved to the northeast corner. The splinted arch was still. She put both hands on the lashing and pulled, testing tension, not because she expected failure now, but because she needed the information to be in her hands rather than only in her head. The lashing held. She exhaled. Then she pushed through the canvas entrance into the outside world. The cold hit her like a wall, not the dynamic cold of a storm. This was static cold, the kind that settles in after a system passes and fills every space the wind has vacated with something denser and more permanent. The thermometer on the farmhouse porch would say something below -20. She didn't need to check it to know. She could feel it in the way her breath turned to vapor before it had traveled 6 inches from her face, in the way the snow under her boots compressed with a sound like breaking glass, rather than the soft crunch of warmer snow. The world was white, not metaphorically, functionally, completely in every direction. The storm had redistributed everything. Fence lines she could navigate by memory were gone. The woodpile was a low white shape that could have been anything. The road, she couldn't find the road. She turned to look at the shelter. It was standing. She'd known it was standing from the inside. Knowing it from the outside was different. From the outside, she could see the whole thing. The dome rising clean from the snow line. The mud composite dark against the white of everything else. The vent openings at the crown still clear, still breathing a faint thread of vapor into the frozen air above them. The structure had taken the storm, and it had not collapsed, and it had not deformed, and it was standing in the gray pre-dawn light exactly as she had built it. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Not with triumph. She wasn't ready for triumph yet. With something quieter, the particular quality of attention you give to a thing that has surprised you by being real when you were not entirely certain it would be. Then she turned toward the road she couldn't find and started walking toward where she knew the neighboring farms were. Walter Hayes's farm was the closest. She found the fence line by feel her boot hitting the buried post and followed it north until the farmhouse shape emerged from the pre-dawn gray. Smoke from the chimney, a lamp in the window. She knocked. He answered immediately, which meant he hadn't slept either. He looked at her standing on his porch in the dark and cold, and the question on his face was so clear she answered it before he could ask. "The shelter held," she said. He looked at her without speaking for a moment. He had the face of a man recalculating something he'd believed was settled. "All 11, he asked. "All 11, she said, standing and breathing as of 20 minutes ago. Another silence, the kind that has weight. "Come inside," he said. "I can't stay. I need to get back. I needed someone to know." She paused. I needed to say it out loud to someone who understood what it meant. Walter Hayes looked at her for a long moment. 19 years of ranching on the northern plains. 3 barns. The winter of 1887. He understood exactly what it meant. "Go back to your cattle," he said quietly. "I'll ride over after sunrise." She nodded and turned back into the dark. Thomas was awake when she came in. He was sitting at the table with the lamp turned up high, and in front of him were 3 pieces of paper covered in his careful handwriting. Diagrams and calculations. The precise angular notation of someone who thinks in systems and can't stop thinking in them even at 4 in the morning, in the aftermath of a disaster that hadn't happened. He looked up when she came through the door. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He read her face the way he'd always read her face, and something in his expression shifted something younger than the sickness, something that had been compressed under months of fever and debt, and the specific burden of being the one who needed taking care of when he was constitutionally unsuited to the role. "All of them?" he asked. "All of them," Clara said. He put down the pencil. He pressed his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. The hands of a 22-year-old man who'd spent 3 weeks sitting on a crate weaving branches and calculating ventilation geometry and splinting arches with his voice when he couldn't do it with his body. Then he looked up. "I want you to know something," he said. "Thomas. Let me say it." His voice was steady. "I want you to know that what you did out there, the design, the construction, the whole of it, I was helpful in places. I know that. But the decision to build it, the refusal to do anything else, the 3 weeks of driving stakes with bleeding hands in frozen ground, that was you. That was entirely you. And I'm going to spend a considerable amount of my life telling people that, and I need you to hear it from me first." Clara stood at the door with her coat still on. She felt something move through her chest that had no clean name, not quite pride, not quite grief. Something that lived between them in the territory where the hardest things settle. "We're not finished yet," she said. "Grayson still has the debt note." "I know," Thomas said. "And the cattle still need to make it through to spring." "I know. And June is still underweight." "Clara, I'm just—" "I know," he said again gently. "But let yourself have this 1 minute. Just this one. The rest of it can wait 60 seconds. She stood in the doorway for a moment, Then she sat down at the table. And she let it be true for 60 seconds that she had built the impossible thing, and the impossible thing had held, and 11 animals were alive in the dark outside, because she had refused to accept the terms that everyone had offered her. 60 seconds. Then she stood up. "I need to check the vent clearance before full sunrise," she said. Thomas picked up his pencil. "I'll have coffee ready when you come back," he said. The daylight, when it came, was merciless in its honesty. She'd half expected it the way daylight after a catastrophic storm shows you the full account of what happened, without any of the ambiguity that darkness permits. She walked the road that had reappeared as the light strengthened, and she saw what the storm had done to the valley. The Morrison farm, 3/4 of a mile south, half the herd in the open field, which meant the barn wall had failed sometime in the night, and the cattle had pushed out through the breach. Some were standing, many were not. She could see Morrison himself moving among them in the distance, and the specific quality of his movement told her everything. The slow, deliberate walk of a man absorbing a loss that hasn't finished arriving yet. The Patterson place beyond that, the barn roof had taken a collapse. The whole east section was down. She did not allow herself to feel relief at these things. There was a version of herself that might have, given what those people had said, given the laughter and the certainty of failure projected at her from every direction. But these were people she knew. People whose animals were her neighbors, the way their owners were, and loss was loss, regardless of who had predicted hers. What she felt instead was the weight of the evidence. The evidence was not ambiguous. Walter Hayes arrived at 9 o'clock, as he'd said he would, and he brought 3 things. She hadn't expected a half sack of good grain, his hired man, Jensen, and Dade. Dade had apparently ridden through the night from his property 60 miles north, which told her more about what kind of man he was than anything he'd said at the fence 3 weeks ago. He was covered in road snow, and his horse was tired, and he had the look of someone who had decided something and ridden directly toward it without stopping to reconsider. He stood in front of the shelter in the morning light for a long time. He walked around it slowly, the way you walk around something when you're trying to understand its structure from the outside, stopping, looking at angles, pressing his hand against the composite walls, looking up at the vent configuration at the crown. Clara stood back and let him look. 60 miles north, he said finally, still looking at the shelter. My situation was similar. I had a timber barn, cost me $400. He paused. East wall failure, same as 88. She said nothing. I lost 61 head, he said. The number landed in the cold air and stayed there. I'm sorry, Clara said. Before I left, I rode past 3 other operations between here and there, Dade said. Losses across all of them. Significant losses. He turned and looked at her. You lost none. I haven't checked June's weight yet this morning, Clara said. He almost smiled. It was a very small, almost smile that told her he understood exactly what kind of person deflects with practical details. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I want to propose something. I'd like to fund the documentation of this construction method. Materials labor cost analysis, structural specifications, written up properly in terms that other ranchers can understand and replicate. I know people across 4 territories who lost animals last night who would spend money to prevent it happening again. He paused. And I suspect you could use the money. She looked at him. What do you get from it? She asked directly. The satisfaction of solving a problem I've had for 7 years, he said. And a percentage of any formal licensing arrangement if this develops into something larger. I'm a practical man, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm not proposing charity. Good, Clara said. I don't want charity. I know, he said. Cooper told me. She looked at Cooper, who had apparently arrived at some point during the circumnavigation of the shelter and was now standing near the entrance looking slightly guilty about being discussed. He said, Dade continued, that you told him doing nothing definitely won't work. He remembered it exactly. People remember exact sentences sometimes when they hit something true. He looked at the shelter. I've been doing nothing about this problem for 7 years. Doing nothing definitely didn't work. The negotiation happened at Clara's table, which was the only table available, and Thomas sat at the end of it with his pencil and his papers, and served as something between a witness and an auditor, following the numbers in real time and flagging anything that didn't balance, which was 2 things, both of which Dade adjusted without argument. What emerged was not a contract. They didn't have a lawyer present, and Clara wouldn't sign anything without reading it properly in good light with sufficient time. But they had a framework. Documentation funded by Dade. Distribution through his existing network of ranch contacts across 4 territories. A percentage structure that Clara had proposed, and Dade had accepted with only minor modification, which told her that her number had been reasonable. The debt to Grayson they did not discuss. That was hers to manage. But the mathematics of the framework, if it held, produced numbers that could address it. Walter Hayes sat through the whole thing without speaking, which was his way of witnessing something, the absolute attentive silence of a man who understood that he was watching something happen that he would describe to people for the rest of his life. When Dade and Cooper had left and Jensen had returned to Hayes's farm, Walter stayed at the table. He turned his hat in his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not just for saying what I said about the shelter." He paused. "I should have helped you. From the beginning. I had materials I wasn't using. I had Jensen available 3 days a week. I saw a woman alone on 30 acres with 11 cattle and a sick brother and a bad debt and a winter coming, and I offered you an opinion when I should have offered you a hand." He looked at the table. "I was comfortable enough that I could afford to watch. You couldn't afford to be watched. Those aren't the same situation, and I should have known that." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You came when it mattered," she said. "Not soon enough." "No," she agreed. "But you came." She looked at him. "The grain you brought this morning. I'm going to use it for June. She needs the caloric weight." He nodded. "Jensen can come Tuesdays," he said. "Through the rest of winter. Whatever you need done. I'll pay him." "In spring," Walter said. "When the debt is managed and the cattle have reproduced. That's when you pay him." He stood up. "That's not charity either. That's what neighbors are supposed to do, and I'm doing it late." He left before she could answer, which she suspected was intentional. Grayson came that afternoon. She'd half expected him, had been expecting him since the storm broke in. The way you expect a thing, when you understand someone's logic well enough to predict their next move. He arrived with the same good coat, the same composed face, the same studied patience. But something in his bearing had changed slightly, a minor adjustment, the kind you only notice if you've been paying close attention to a person for weeks. He stood at the fence and looked at the shelter. He looked at it for a long time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Grayson." "The Morrison farm lost 14 head," he said. "Patterson lost more. I've been writing since dawn." "I know," she said. "Your shelter survived the storm." "It did." Silence. "All 11 animals," he said. It wasn't a question. "All 11." Another silence. Grayson was a man who dealt in leverage, and Clara could see him recalculating in real time, could see the positions shifting, the way pieces shift when the board changes suddenly, and the strategy that was correct 3 moves ago is no longer correct. "The debt note," he said finally. "Yes." "I'm prepared to extend the repayment window," he said. 6 months. Given. He looked at the shelter. The changed circumstances. Clara looked at him. "I'm not asking for an extension," she said. He looked back at her. The composure held, but something behind it adjusted. "Then what are you asking for?" "I'm asking for your patience for 60 days, she said. "Not an extension, a renegotiation. By the end of 60 days, I'll have the documentation income from Dade, and I'll have a full accounting of what the debt settlement should look like, given what the property can now demonstrably produce." She paused. "You know Dade." "I know of him." Then you know his word is worth the paper it'll be written on, she said. And you know that what happened here last night changes what this operation is worth, to you and to me both. Grayson was quiet for a moment. You're negotiating, he said. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, not warmth exactly, but a different register of attention. The register reserved for people who turn out to be different than you assess them. I'm telling you the truth about my situation, Clara said, which is what I've been doing every time you've come here. You just didn't know what to do with it. He looked at the shelter one more time. 60 days, he said. 60 days. He nodded once, a small definitive movement that meant the decision was made and he wouldn't revisit it. Good day, Mrs. Whitmore. Good day, Mr. Grayson. He rode away, and Clara watched him go and felt the 60 days settle around her like something she could actually carry. The crisis came at dusk. She'd been so focused on Grayson on Dade, on the structural documentation she'd begun sketching at the table, while Thomas ate real food for the first time in days, that she'd been to the shelter twice in the afternoon without truly seeing what she was looking at. It was the third visit in the last gray light of the evening that she saw it. June, not standing. She was down in the far corner of the shelter weight on one side, the position of an animal that has lain down because standing has become more costly than the risk of the ground. Clara was on her knees beside her before she'd made a conscious decision to move her hands moving across the heifer's neck and shoulder, reading temperature and muscle tension and the quality of the breathing. The breathing was the problem. Shallow. Faster than it should be. The specific breathing pattern of a respiratory tract under stress, not the labored breathing of an animal that was cold, but the tight compensating breath of one whose airways were irritated. She pressed her ear against the heifer's ribcage. She heard it. The moisture. The subtle, wet crackle of a lung that had taken in what it shouldn't have. Not pneumonia yet. Not fully. But the beginning of it. The early stage sound of tissue reacting to something it had been exposed to the cold air that had come in during the storm's peak, the hours of moisture-laden air before the ventilation had fully regulated some combination of stresses that June's already compromised system hadn't been able to absorb without cost. Clara sat back on her heels. This was the thing. This was the thing that had been waiting, not the storm, not Grayson, not the splinted arch. June. The weakest point had found its moment. She had two options, and she knew both of them in the first 10 seconds. She could ride for the veterinarian in town, which was 4 miles in post-storm dark and cold, which would take time she didn't know if June had, and which would cost money that existed now only as a framework and a promise and 60 days. Or she could manage it herself through the night with what she had. She'd treated animals for respiratory stress before. She knew the interventions, steam warmth keeping the animal upright enough that the lung congestion couldn't pool. She knew what she was doing. What she didn't know was whether it was enough. She put her hand flat on June's flank and felt the breathing. "Stay with me," she said. June's ear turned at the sound of her voice. "I need you to stay with me," Clara said. "We have come too far for you to stop now. I mean that seriously. I built you a house out of trees, and you are not allowed to be ungrateful about it." The ear turned again. "Good," Clara said. "Stay angry about it if you need to. That's fine. Just stay." She sent Thomas for every piece of equipment she'd need: the large kettle, the extra canvas, the medicinal herbs she'd been keeping dry in the tin near the stove, and he went without argument, moving faster than she'd seen him move since October, the crisis burning through whatever fatigue had been accumulating, giving him 20 minutes of something close to his former strength. She worked through the twilight and into the dark building, a contained steam environment around June's corner of the shelter, monitoring the breathing. Keeping the heifer oriented correctly, talking to her without pause, because she'd found long ago that sick animals responded to voice even when they showed no outward sign of it. It was Thomas coming in with the third load of supplies who saw her face and understood. "She's going to make it," he said. Clara looked up. "You don't know that." "No," he said. He crouched beside her. But you're not going to let her not make it. And with you, those are usually the same thing. Clara looked at him. Then she looked at June, whose breathing was marginally less tight than it had been 30 minutes ago. Marginally, which was not enough, but was something. Was the beginning of something. Outside, the temperature was still falling. Inside, Clara Whitmore stayed exactly where she was and did not stop. June's breathing changed at 2 in the morning. Clara felt it before she heard it, felt it through the palm she'd kept pressed against the heifer's ribcage for the better part of 6 hours, that steady monitoring contact that had become less a diagnostic tool and more a form of conversation. The tight compensating rhythm loosened by a fraction. Just a fraction. But fractions were everything now. Fractions were the whole argument. She pressed her ear to the ribcage. The wet crackle was still there, but quieter. The tissue was responding. Clara sat back and looked at the ceiling of the shelter. The woven branches overhead, the mud composite dark between them, the faint silver of moonlight coming through the vent openings at the crown. She had been in this shelter for so many hours across so many days that she knew every inch of it. The way you know a room you've been sick in, not fondly, not yet, but with the intimate familiarity of a place where something important happened to you. "There you are," she said quietly. June's ear moved. "There you are," Clara said again. Not louder, just with more weight behind it. Thomas had fallen asleep against the far wall around midnight, and she'd let him had made the decision without hesitation because he'd earned the sleep and his body was still fighting its own interior battle, and she didn't need him awake to do what she was doing. She needed him well. Those were different requirements, and she'd learned over the past weeks to stop conflating them. She worked alone through the remaining dark hours, maintaining the steam, monitoring the breathing, keeping June's position correct. The other cattle had arranged themselves around the heifer in a way that struck her as deliberate, the herd forming a ring of warmth around the weakest member, collective body heat, directed inward, which was either bovine instinct or something she didn't have a clean word for and didn't need one. By 4 in the morning, the crackle in June's breathing had diminished to something she had to listen hard to find. By 5, it was nearly gone. At 5:30, June shifted her weight, gathered her legs beneath her, and stood. Clara sat on the frozen earth and watched her stand and breathed out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since dusk. Then she pressed her face into her own knees for 30 seconds and let everything that had been building since the storm arrived move through her without fighting it, because she was alone and the cattle didn't care, and 30 seconds was enough. 30 seconds. Then she got up. She had work to do. The morning that followed was the quietest she could remember. Not quiet, because nothing was happening. Quiet. The way the air is quiet after a long argument has finally resolved a silence with substance to it, a silence that meant something, rather than merely the absence of sound. She fed the cattle. She checked the shelter's structural points one final time in the daylight, running her hands over everything that had been tested, and had held cataloging it the way you catalog things that have proven themselves. She cleared the vent openings of the light frost that had formed overnight. She checked June's breathing every 30 minutes, and each time the answer was the same, clearer, steadier. The body doing what bodies do when the worst has passed and they're allowed to begin the work of recovery. Thomas woke at 7 with the particular disorientation of someone who'd fallen asleep in an unexpected place and took a moment to reconstruct why. He looked at June standing in the morning light filtering through the shelter entrance. He looked at Clara. "All night?" he asked. "All night," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should sleep." "I will. Now, Clara, not eventually. Now." "There are things I am capable," he said with a firmness she hadn't heard from him since before the sickness, "of watching 11 cattle breathe for 4 hours. I have been watching things from a cot for 3 months. I am extremely good at watching things. Go inside and sleep." She looked at him. The color in his face was better than it had been in weeks. His breathing was steady. He was standing without bracing himself against anything, weight distributed evenly, which was the kind of detail she'd been monitoring without mentioning because she didn't want to make it a thing he was aware of. He was getting better. The thought arrived with a force that surprised her, not because she hadn't hoped for it, but because hope maintained over a long period becomes a habit rather than a feeling, something you do rather than something you experience, and experiencing it again directly was sharper than she'd expected. If June shows any change in her breathing, I will come immediately. And if the northeast arch... Clara. Fine, she said. She went inside and lay down on the cot and was asleep before the thought completed. Oh wait, she slept 4 hours, which was not enough, and was everything. When she woke, Thomas was at the table with his papers. Not the ventilation calculations this time, new papers with different notation. She sat up and looked at them from across the room. What are you writing? She asked. The construction method, he said without looking up. Full specification, material ratios, arch geometry, vent placement, composite mixture proportions, the splinting technique. Everything. Dade will need it properly documented, and you'll be too busy to write it, and I am currently not busy at all. He paused. I'm also writing the failure modes, the northeast arch, the compression fracture pattern under directional wind load shift. That's information that improves the design. Future versions of this structure shouldn't have that vulnerability. Clara sat up fully. Future versions, she said. This isn't a one-off solution, Thomas said. He set down his pencil and looked at her. You know that. You've known it since Dade came. What you built here is a method. Methods can travel. Methods can be replicated by people with less than you had, less money, less land, less time. That's the thing about a method that doesn't require expensive materials. He picked his pencil back up. It belongs to anyone who needs it. Clara sat at the edge of the cot for a moment, thinking about that. She thought about the Morrison farm, and the Patterson place, and Dade's 61 head, and the winter of 1887, and every rancher in every cold territory who had ever stood in front of a failed barn and tried to calculate what they'd lost in terms that didn't break something in them to say out loud. Add a section on site selection, she said. Creek-adjacent locations for clay access. Southern exposure for the entrance. Prevailing wind assessment before you set the arch orientation. Thomas wrote without looking up. Already in there. And the cattle hair specify that winter coat harvest is essential. It won't work with summer coat. The fiber density is different. Also in there. She got up and went to look over his shoulder. He'd written 12 pages. She read in silence for 2 minutes. The notation was precise, and the prose between the technical specifications was clear enough that a person without Thomas's instinct for systems could follow it. She tested it by imagining Walter Hayes, reading it, running through his 19 years of barn-building logic, and checking whether the text would bring him to understanding rather than confusion. It would. This is good, she said quietly. It's thorough, Thomas said. You can decide if it's good. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He didn't look up from the writing, but she felt him hold the contact for a moment before she moved away. Grayson came on the 53rd day, not the 60th. The 53rd, which meant he'd been thinking about it for a week and had decided not to wait the full window, which told her something about where his thinking had landed. She'd had time to consider what that landing might look like, and she'd spent part of that consideration talking to Dade, who knew Grayson in the wider way that men of a certain standing knew each other across territories not well but accurately. She was ready for him. He came to the door of the farmhouse this time, not the fence. The fence was for watching from. The door was for something different. She let him in. He sat at the table where the construction documentation was stacked in a neat pile. Thomas had made a clean copy, and then a second clean copy, because 1 was a document, and 2 was the beginning of a record. Grayson looked at the papers without touching them. Dade's arrangement is formalized. he asked. Signed last week, Clara said. He nodded. He had done his arithmetic already. She could see that in his face, in the way a man looks when the numbers have resolved, and he's arrived at a meeting to confirm what he already knows, rather than to discover it. And the first documentation income. Sufficient to address a significant portion of the debt, Clara said. Not all of it, but enough to establish that the full amount is manageable within an 18-month timeline, given the spring reproduction and the ongoing documentation arrangement. Grayson was quiet for a moment. The cattle are healthy, he said. All 11, June fully recovered. The shelter. Standing, Clara said. I'll use it next winter too. With modifications, Thomas has redesigned the arch base anchor to address the compression fracture vulnerability under directional wind load shift. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who had arrived at a situation having predicted one version of it and found a different version instead, not worse, just genuinely different from the calculation he'd built his approach around. She understood the adjustment required. She gave him time to make it. I want to put the extended repayment in writing, he said finally. I have the terms prepared, Clara said. She placed the document in front of him. 18 months. Monthly accounting provided to you directly. No lien extension on the property during that period. He read it. He read it the way careful men read things fully, not performing thoroughness, but actually achieving it. He looked up. You wrote this yourself? With Thomas's help on the legal phrasing. A pause. Something moved across Grayson's face that she hadn't seen there before. Not respect exactly, because men like Grayson didn't arrive at respect easily or announce it when they did. But an adjustment. A permanent one, the kind that doesn't reverse when the meeting ends. The no lien clause, he said, is non-negotiable, Clara said. He looked at the document. Then he took the pen from the table and signed it. Spring came. The way spring always comes to the northern plains, not gently, not with the soft arrival of warmer climates, but with a kind of aggressive intention. The cold retreating in stages and then suddenly, definitively, the ground releasing its grip on itself and becoming something workable again. Clara was in the cattle pen when she heard the sound. A calf. The first of the season Bella's, which was as it should be the oldest leading even in this. The calf was on its feet within the hour, which was its own kind of argument, its own small proof that the winter had not taken what it had come to take. She stood at the fence and watched it find its legs, and felt something she had no interest in naming, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. 3 more calves came in the following 2 weeks. The herd was growing. The day the first letter arrived was an ordinary Tuesday. It came from a ranching operation in Montana, a man named Erickson, who had heard about the shelter method through Dade's network and had read the documentation and wanted to know if Mrs. Whitmore would be willing to answer specific questions about the arch geometry as applied to a site with different soil composition than the creek-adjacent clay she'd specified. She read it twice. Then she sat down and wrote back. The second letter came from Wyoming. The third from the Dakota Territory. The fourth, which arrived with 3 others in the same week from a woman in Minnesota, a widow with a small operation and a brutal winter forecast who had read the documentation and wanted to know if she could do this alone without help with no background in construction. Clara held that letter for a long time. She thought about the morning she had stood at the edge of her land with $30 and 11 cattle and a sick brother, and the almanac's verdict on what was coming. She thought about the first stake she'd driven into the frozen ground before sunrise with bleeding hands. She thought about the sound of the mallet, and the sound of the ground refusing, and the sound of the mallet again. She wrote back to the woman in Minnesota. Yes, she wrote, you can do this alone. I know because I did. Here is what you will need, and here is the order you will need it in, and here is what will crack and what to do when it does. The ground will be harder than you think. Your hands will tell you to stop before your work is done. Don't listen to your hands. The materials you need are on your own land. Look at the trees that have already survived every winter your property has seen and ask them what they know. They have been answering this question for longer than either of us has been alive. Build toward the storm, not away from it. The storm is coming regardless. The only question is what you have built by the time it arrives. She signed it. She sealed it. She sent it. Thomas was fully recovered by June, not the partial recovery she'd been quietly accepting and pretending was sufficient full recovery, the kind that announced itself in the way a person carries their body, in the return of the ease that illness steals and health restores without ceremony. He was eating. He was working. He had taken over the correspondence management with the efficiency of someone who had spent 3 months lying still doing nothing but thinking, and had emerged with approximately 4 months of accumulated organizational energy looking for somewhere to go. He was also, she noticed, laughing more. Not at anything in particular, just more. The general baseline of his life had shifted upward in some register that she couldn't fully account for, and decided not to try. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch after supper, and the light had gone that particular gold. It goes in the northern summer, when the days are long and the work is done, and there is nothing immediate requiring attention. It was a rare condition. She was still learning to inhabit it. "Do you know what I think about?" Thomas said. "Tell me." "The first day, when you came home with the idea." He looked out at the pasture where the herd moved in the long evening light, 11 adults and 4 new calves. The mathematics of survival, expressing itself in the most direct possible terms. "You explained it to me, and I thought I didn't say this, but I thought this won't work. Not because I had a better idea, just because it was so far outside what anyone had done that I couldn't see it working." "But you helped," Clara said. "I helped because you were going to do it regardless," he said. "And because being useful to something that might not work seemed better than being useless to nothing." He paused. "But I didn't believe in it. Not the way you did. I believed in you. That was different." Clara thought about the difference, believing in a thing and believing in the person doing the thing. She understood them as separate now in a way she hadn't at the beginning understood that what had kept her driving stakes in frozen ground at 4 in the morning wasn't certainty that it would work. She'd never had that. What she'd had was the specific conviction that not trying was a kind of destruction she could actually prevent, that the only failure she fully controlled was the failure to attempt. Everything else, the storm, the Archjune's lungs, Grayson's pen on the paper, all of it had been outside her control. All of it had required her to build the thing, and then trust it, and then find out. "It worked," she said. "It worked." Thomas agreed. The light continued to do what it was doing. The calves moved among the adults, learning the geography of the pasture, bumping softly against the older animals, who absorbed the contact without breaking stride. Yet, in the fall before the first frost, Clara walked the perimeter of the shelter alone. She ran her hands along the exterior walls the way she had done every day through the winter. Not because they needed checking now, not with the modifications Thomas had integrated, and the additional mud layer she'd applied in August, and the re-anchored arch bases sunk 2 feet deeper than the originals. She did it because it was hers, because she had made it, and it had held. And the fact of that was still something she needed to feel with her hands at intervals. The way you keep returning to a truth that was hard to arrive at, just to confirm it hasn't moved. The living wood had done what she'd known living wood would do. The arches had continued to grow. Slowly, imperceptibly, in daily observation, but visibly to anyone who knew what the structure had looked like in January. The birches thickening at their bases, the wood gaining girth and strength, the arch members becoming something more substantial than the flexible sapling she'd bent into position in frozen ground with bleeding hands. The shelter was not just surviving, it was improving. The living material was becoming a better version of what she'd asked it to be. She stood at the crown of the structure and looked north across the valley. She could see the modifications her neighbors had made to their operations, the adjustments that told her without anyone needing to say it that the method had traveled beyond the documentation, beyond Dade's network, beyond the letters to Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas. She could see it in the fence line placements and the site orientations and the small intentional stand of young birches that Walter Hayes had planted along his creek boundary in the spring, a stand that had no purpose other than the future. He'd planted it without saying anything about it. She hadn't said anything either. Some acknowledgments are clearer in action than in words. The second almanac warning came in September. Another severe winter, possibly worse than the last. She read it at the table over morning coffee and set it down without the constriction in her chest that last year's reading had produced. Not because she was confident confidence was the wrong word for what she had now. Confidence implied certainty, implied that the outcome was known. What she had was something different, steadier and less brittle. The knowledge that she had faced the worst available version of this problem with the least available preparation and had built something that held. Whatever this winter brought, she knew more than she had known before. She had better materials, better techniques, a modified design that addressed last year's failure points. She had Thomas at full capacity. She had Walter's standing offer of Jensen on Tuesdays. She had a herd of 15. She had most fundamentally the proof. Not the proof that she would survive, no one owned that proof in advance. But the proof that survival was buildable. That it could be assembled from the materials at hand, from the trees on the land, from the problem turned over in the dark, until the answer appeared from the refusal to accept that the only options were the ones other people could see. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the morning was cold and clear, and the herd moved across the pasture in the long autumn light. 15 animals with their winter coats coming in thick and dense, the calves from spring indistinguishable now from the adults in size, if not yet in manner. Bella was at the front, as she always was. Clara watched her and thought about the shape of what a year could do. 12 months ago, she had stood in this same light with $30 and 11 animals, and a winter that everyone agreed would take everything. She had not had money. She had not had lumber. She had not had the endorsement of a single person who knew this land and this weather better than she did. She had had the trees. She had had the problem which contained its own answer if you pressed yourself against it long enough and refused to look away. She had had the absolute unwillingness to lose what she loved without having first tried the thing that no one believed in. And that, not the shelter, not the documentation income, not Grayson's signature or Dade's network, or Walter's belated decency, that refusal was what had built everything that came after. The storm had not made her. She had made herself in the years and the losses and the long quiet labor that preceded the storm. The storm had only asked her to prove it. She had answered. Clara Whitmore set down her coffee, pulled on her coat, and walked out to meet whatever was coming. She had work to do, and she knew now that she was exactly the person to do it.